The overthrow of Lukashenko's 30 years dictatorship is one of this year's potential black swans, according to futurists and international analysts interviewed by Politico. Their reasoning is straightforward. If the Belarusian people see Putin's vulnerabilities, such as those exposed in Syria, they might believe he can no longer protect Lukashenko. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the exiled leader of Belarus's democratic forces, periodically calls on Belarusians to prepare for mass protests.
Каждый раз я спрашиваю себя, почему мы должны с этим мириться?
She also explores scenarios for a potential coup, including the involvement of the Kalinouski Regiment, currently fighting to defend Ukraine. At the same time, Belarusian cyberguerrillas, self-described hacktivists, are quietly gathering sensitive information. While their work is significant, its role in toppling a brutal dictator remains uncertain. Lukashenko has proven adept at survival, using political kidnappings, assassination, and tactical maneuvering even against Putin to cling to power. Today, with no extremes, we'll explore why Belarusians have struggled to resist the Lukashenko regime so far, and whether the last dictatorship in Europe could finally fall. On January 26, Belarus had its so-called presidential election, during which the Belarusian people seemingly forced their poor, exhausted dictator Lukashenko to continue robbing them, repressing them, and keeping them under sanctions. No international observers, no transparent vote counting system, no polling stations abroad, no real candidates, as many had fled persecution.
И все-таки как можно назвать эти выборы демократичными, когда ваши самые ярые противники и соперники или находятся в тюрьме, или в изгнании?
Кто в тюрьме, кто в изгнании и прочее, а ты вот здесь. Это право выбора, это демократично.
No independent polling. Instead, political prisoners, both old and new, preemptive arrest of protest-prone citizens, intimidation, an election campaign in TikTok.
Алкаши меньше болеют. Но это не значит, что по пол-ведра в день выпивать. Нет. Я же говорил, что рюмочку не больше. А некоторые говорят, а президент сказал, будем пить.
And conveniently curated pocket version of YouTube. 5 years ago, when Belarusians took to the streets en masse to challenge Lukashenko's usurpation of power, he deployed every method in dictator's playbook to hold on. Internet blackouts, tear gas, flashbang grenades, and even live ammunition to disperse protests. Across the country, mass detentions, beating, and torture became the norm. This year, on election day, opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya gathered in Warsaw with exiled opposition figure Pavel Latushka and others. Together, they sought inspiration at the Belarusians Deserve Better forum, which alternated between speeches and musical performances. How effective or sufficient this form of protest might be a rhetorical yet thorny question. Belarus has recently stopped renewing expired passports for its citizens abroad, regardless of gender and background. This forces people into an impossible choice: renounce their citizenship or risk returning to Belarus. A popular scheme to topple Lukashenko's dictatorship is, to put it blindly, a bit audacious, relying on all-powerful Ukrainians instead of themselves. The imagined scenario: Ukrainians dismantle the Russian Empire. Moscow's support for Lukashenko weakens or vanishes. His system begins to crumble and elites splinter. And that's when the liberators ride in on White Emperor's tanks. But sociological data from Chatham House dampens even this optimism. In foreign policy, most Belarusians still cling to the naive hope of friendly relations with both West and Russia. Yet neither Lukashenko nor the democratic movement can offer this fantasy. After all, you cannot sit on two chairs at once. You can't align with a dictatorship fueled by propaganda and war ambitions, while simultaneously striving to be close to open democratic societies. In general, Belarusians agree that their country needs change. Many recognize that the current system is propped up by security forces and officials with unchecked power. However, a quarter of citizens still believe in the necessity of a strong hand, and just as many don't consider themselves Democrats.
Моя мама голосовала за Лукашенко все время, до смерти. И я голосовал за Лукашенко все время.
But you consider yourself a supporter of independent journalism. Why haven't you liked and subscribed yet? Have you now? Good. With clear conscience, let's keep going.
Многія чакаюць, што менавіта в эры з полка Каліноўскага вызваляць Беларусь. Канешне, тут можа быць шмат сцэнароў, і я б хацела, каб усё адбылося мірна, але хто яго ведае, як будзе.
The Kalinouski Regiment, formed by Belarusian volunteers, is part of Ukraine's armed forces under the main Directorate of Intelligence. Many hope its fighters, reporting to Ukrainian intelligence chief Kyrylo Budanov, will become a driving force in Belarusian politics and a unifying core for the country's democratic forces. Such scenario is not out of the question, especially if Putin's failures on additional fronts like Syria inspire hope. However, the nuclear weapons stationed in Belarus by Putin and Lukashenko could provide Moscow with pretext for open invasion, claiming they are protecting their nuclear assets from extremists. Moreover, documents attributed to the Kremlin, deemed authentic by international investigators, suggest Russia aims to absorb Belarus by 2030. For now, Putin relies on coercion rather than war, but would be forced to adapt if events spiral out of control. The only way Belarus will change is through force, a Kalinouski Regiment recruiter told The Economist in Warsaw. He added, "What if our fighters entered Brest and Homel after Russia loses?" Indeed, many Belarusian volunteers see fighting Putin in Ukraine as their contribution to dismantling Lukashenko's regime, believing that defeating Putin is the only way to remove Lukashenko. According to Tikhanovskaya, about 1,500 Belarusians have fought in Ukraine, with some returning injured and 60 have died in the effort. Notably, Vadim Kabanchuk, a former deputy commander of the Kalinouski Regiment, now serves as a transitional cabinet's representative for national security and defense. The transitional cabinet headquartered in Vilnius act as a collective executive body for Lukashenko's opposition. BIPOL, an association of former Belarusian security officers, trains partisans and conducts operations inside Belarus, including the strike on a Russian airbase. While supporting Tikhanovskaya, BIPOL predicts her eventual resignation, citing EU frustration with her limited results and pressure to change leadership. Critics argue that Kabanchuk, leading the security bloc, lacks political experience. Meanwhile, Lukashenko's forces claim to have hacked Kabanchuk's Telegram account, revealing internal opposition discord, mistrust, and intrigue. This breach has fueled propaganda, with Lukashenko's investigative committee gloating over the leaks. Additionally, Lukashenko's agents continue to attempt to infiltrate the Kalinouski Regiment. Belarusian cyber partisans counter these efforts, playing a crucial role in protecting the regiment from espionage. We've grown used to fearing nuclear weapons, but cyber weapons are even more terrifying. Belarusian dictator Lukashenko declared in 2022, following a series of cyber attacks on the country's railway management system. On the third day of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, cyber attacks targeted communication nodes and gateways of Belarusian railways, halting the transport of Russian military equipment across Belarus. Later, terabytes of data, including internal documents from a logistic firm serving the Russian military, were extracted.
Нужно создавать систему безопасности на тех объектах, которые будут атакованы в случае кибервойны.
In Belarus, involvement in the cyber partisan movement is punishable by up to 15 years in prison. The only publicly identified member, Yuliana Shemetovets, serves as a group spokesperson. Living in the US, she is considered a terrorist by the Belarusian regime. The cyber partisans have aligned with the Kalinouski Regiment, focusing on cyber intelligence and digital security. Occasionally, they target businesses such as Grodno Azot, where they claim to have disrupted operation about a year ago. What they envision for the regime's final days is unclear. They openly discuss various scenarios, drawing inspiration from Gene Sharp's handbook on nonviolent resistance, a guide that influenced Ukraine's Orange Revolution.
Ненасильственные, например, протесты, они включают в себя, если даже почитать там эту книгу Шарпа, на которую ссылаются очень много экспертов, то там и там, например, блокирование дорог, и там создание каких-то фейковых денежных средств, например, для распространения. То есть там все равно очень много каких-то действий, которые людьми у нас не воспринимаются как ненасильственный протест. Я это вижу через создание силового компонента. Конечно, без этого силового компонента я не думаю, что у нас будет шанс на смену режима.
Dubbed the Machiavelli of non-violent struggle, Sharp's ideas remain our cornerstone for activists. If you'd like us to analyze his work, let us know in the comments. We also have a detailed breakdown of the original Machiavelli. Don't forget to check that video as well. Returning to the cyber partisans' plans. In their early days in 2020, anonymous hackers threatened to cause a blackout and paralyze the country's banking and tax systems. We can kill the ruble and freeze your friends' accounts, they warned Lukashenko. While these dramatic actions haven't materialized, the group insists that the lack of visible updates don't mean inactivity. Their work continues under the radar, and surveys suggest nearly every Belarusian is aware of their efforts. Meanwhile, Lukashenko's government has been investing in STEM education, seeking to stem the brain drain triggered by its repressive policies. Belarus's IT sector, once thriving, was anchored at the high technology park in Minsk, modeled after Silicon Valley. It offered tax incentives and an ecosystem for startups. However, Belarus's involvement in the war and Western clients' ethical stances have driven mass relocation of IT companies. However, involvement of Belarus in the war and Western clients' ethical stances have driven mass relocation of IT companies. Those who remain face increasing risks. IT professionals, often well-paid and publicly supporting resistance efforts, are frequent targets of fabricated criminal charges and harassment. As Belarusian opposition figure Franek Vachorka aptly put it, Lukashenko and Putin hate each other, but they need each other. This claim aligns with a recent statement by the Ukrainian president, who revealed that in early days of Russia's full-scale invasion, Lukashenko apologized for missiles launched from Belarusian territory.
Believe me, that's what he told me. Volodya, this is not me. I'm not in charge, he told me. I'm not in charge. These are just missiles. This is Putin. I told him, don't do that. This was done without me.
Despite Putin's efforts, he has so far failed to integrate Belarusian troops into his army, unlike the North Koreans. Lukashenko was first elected as Belarus's president in 1994, riding on an opposition platform. He criticized officials for embezzling factors, selling weapons, and enriching themselves illegally while promising to make the press independent. In 1999, he signed the so-called Union State Treaty with Yeltsin, which some historians argue was driven by Lukashenko's ambitions. Given Yeltsin's poor health and declining popularity, Lukashenko reportedly hoped to lead this new union. Today, Putin funds Lukashenko's repressive regime. In 2020, the Kremlin lent him $1.5 billion to suppress protests. Rich in resources, Russia supplies Belarus with cheap gas and subsidized crude oil, which Belarus refines and sells at a profit. These low-interest loans and energy subsidies keep the Belarusian economy afloat despite escalating Western sanctions. Notably, sanctions are nothing new for Belarus. They've been a reality since 1997, when the EU downgraded relations with Minsk below its ministerial level. This move followed a 1996 referendum where Lukashenko subordinated parliament and granted himself what he called Tsar-like powers. With Russia's help, he avoided impeachment, and sanctions have accompanied nearly every subsequent Belarusian election. 8 years later, another referendum posed a single question: should Lukashenko be allowed to run for a third term? It also proposed amending the constitution to remove term limits entirely. Although Belarus's electoral code explicitly prohibits referendum on such matters, the vote proceeded.
Вы знаете, если бы этого референдума не было, его стоило бы придумать, потому что он как никогда в эти дни сплотил нацию. И, может быть, дал урок патриотизма нашей молодежи.
Predictably, 8 out of 10 approved. Sanctions followed, and Lukashenko extended his rule. It's almost hard to believe now, but a decade ago, Lukashenko refused to recognize the annexation of Crimea. Back then, many in Moscow believed he was exploiting them economically while withholding loyalty. The two countries even engaged in trade wars, like the infamous Milk Wars. At the time, Lukashenko would occasionally declare, "We are not Russians, we are Belarusians."
Все должны понять, что Беларусь – это навсегда, это наше. Это никогда больше не будет ни польское, ни российское, ни американское или немецкое.
Now, however, Lukashenko systematically disregards the Belarusian language, claiming to be an internationalist. Today, speaking Belarusian has become a marker of resistance to the regime, and in some cases, people even have been arrested for using it. Meanwhile, as Ukrainians push Europeans to adopt Kyiv over Kiev, Belarusians face their own challenges, such as convincing Germans to say Belarus instead of Vice-Russland. Like Ukraine, they find themselves explaining historical distinctions between Rus and Russia. Belarus's national flag also reflects its struggles. Historically white, red, white, it was replaced with Soviet-era symbolism after yet another of Lukashenko's referendums. Interestingly, just last Christmas season, the government banned Santa Claus and English-language holiday songs in schools, recommending adherence to Russian New Year traditions instead. None of these bans, however, compare to the regime's repressive machinery. Lukashenko, with his semi-comedic media image, has unleashed a brutal apparatus to retain power. In 2021, the world was shocked by his act of air piracy. He forced a Ryanair passenger flight from Greece to Lithuania to land in Minsk under the pretense of bomb threat, which unsurprisingly turned out to be false. The real target was Roman Protasevich, co-founder and former editor of the opposition Telegram channel Nechta. Arrested and sentenced to 8 years in prison, Protasevich later appeared to cooperate with the regime, possibly under torture. He was eventually pardoned and even allowed to visit prominent opposition leader Viktor Babaryka in a penal colony, a man whose family had not seen him in 18 months. According to human rights group, as of this video's recording, there are 1,247 political prisoners in Belarus. Last year alone, around 9,000 people faced various forms of repression, including arrests, interrogations, and raids, excluding those who managed to flee the country. Yet Belarusian intelligence doesn't stop at its borders. In the summer of 2021, young Belarusian activist Vitaly Shushov was found hanged in a Kyiv park. He had been helping Belarusians relocate and organizing protests against Lukashenko's regime. His friends insist he had no enemies other than the regime. The assassination of journalist Pavel Sheremet, who died in a car explosion in Kyiv 5 years earlier, has been also linked to Belarusian authorities. Audio recordings from Belarus's KGB obtained by journalists reveal discussions of assassinating Sheremet in 2012 under Lukashenko's order. Sheremet, considered one of the Lukashenko's personal enemies, co-authored the book Accidental President, which detailed the abductions and killing of Lukashenko's opponents in the late 90s. During that period, Belarus saw the emergence of so-called death squads, allegedly composed of members of the SOBR Special Forces unit. Among their victims were former Deputy Prime Minister Viktor Hanchar and opposition leader Yuri Zakharanka, who disappeared under mysterious circumstances after challenging Lukashenko. Against this backdrop, Lukashenko's words quoted by Sheremet seemed especially cynical. "I've always fought against power, against its stupidity. My life has hung by a thread many times." Lukashenko has yet to choose a successor. Some speculate he is grooming his youngest son Kolya for the presidency. The teenager, whom Belarusian propaganda compares to Britain Prince William, stood alongside his father during the suppression of the 2020 protests. we can hope that Belarus will one day see fair elections, not the passing of the throne. The persistent grip of dictatorship in Belarus can likely be attributed to a unique formula. A power-hungry narcissist, willing to crush opponents through a well-fed security apparatus. Complete financial dependence on Russia, a situation intentionally cultivated to maintain control over the state. A passive majority. Many citizens, despite examples of others, as well as their own experience, cling to the belief that the country can balance between Europe and its northern neighbor. While the idea of an optimistic scenario, Putin's defeat on the Ukrainian front leading to Lukashenko's downfall, sounds appealing, this outcome seems distant for now. Belarus cannot solely rely on cyber warfare or activists to achieve freedom. If this one does come, it is bound to surprise us all. Just as unexpected collapse of Bashar al-Assad's power last year. Gene Sharp and Authority on Strategies Against Oppression reminds us, one should not assume an easy way to escape dictatorship. On the contrary, planning and executing effective actions will always be extraordinarily challenging. What do you think? Will Lukashenko's regime collapse through force or non-violent means? Are there situations where escaping extremes and resorting to violence is unavoidable? Or is it possible his regime won't fall at all? Share your thoughts and arguments in the comments below. See you soon.